Mulder X-Files territory.
Yeah.
I think their main focus has always been to gain control of a large segment of that border fence. New Generation Cartel, as of now, doesn't really have a direct control over it.
President Trump's war on drug trafficking getting even larger in scale, the president declaring cartels as unlawful combatants, paving the way.
An uneasy quiet settles over the courtroom as the verdict finally lands. The case has dragged on for months, framed by the relentless headlines that accompany the sentence of one of the world's most infamous cartel figures. The person widely identified as the head of the CJNG, El Mencho, sits at the defense table, eyes fixed on the bench, a calm mask slipping only for a heartbeat when the judge begins to speak. What unfolds is not only a judgment about crime and punishment, but a stark reminder of how quickly a courtroom can become a theater of risk when a figure of violence stands in judgment's light. The verdict is read in measured terms: multiple charges, years of potential captivity, and a warning shot across the bow of criminal enterprise. In a room designed to uphold the rule of law, the atmosphere tilts toward tension as the court nears the moment of formal conclusion. Before the sentence lands, the prosecution has laid out a record of violence, money, and influence. The defense counters with arguments about due process, possible political interference, and the limits of evidence. Jurors and officials listen with professional restraint, yet the air hums with unspoken questions about what a verdict might provoke beyond the walls of the courtroom. Reporters, cameras, legal aides, and security personnel fill the aisles, shoulders brushing in a choreography of procedure. The judge's voice is calm and precise, delivering the sentence with the gravity that the moment demands. Then, with the sentence complete, a sudden movement fractures the orderly progression of the proceedings. A figure lunges toward the bench, a gesture powered by decades of intimidation and a desire to send a direct message to the judiciary. The courtroom erupts into a controlled cascade of shouts, swearing, and the clatter of chairs as onlookers recoil. The assailant, seeing the risk of immediate retaliation, is restrained by trained security officers who act with practiced speed. The judges, staff, and prosecutors retreat behind shields of protection, and the public gallery, once a focal point of attention, becomes a scene of tense, rapid rearrangement. Security teams move as one, interceding with a mix of restraint and force that is proportionate to the threat. Within moments, the introductory threat is neutralized, and the court floor empties into a safer arrangement under the watchful gaze of external law enforcement. The attacked official, shielded, escapes the moment unharmed but visibly shaken, their demeanor signaling that the risk of violence in high-stakes cases has not vanished. A post-incident protocol unfolds. Medical checks, statements for the record, and a pause that allows tremors in the room to calm and the jurors to regain composure. Outside observers and the audience following the case through live feeds weigh the implications. The incident raises critical questions about courtroom security, the vulnerability of public officials, and the chilling effect such acts can have on testimony and verdicts. Investigators begin a review of how the attack could occur, what gaps existed, and how to seal them in future proceedings. In the broader landscape, this moment is read as a reminder of the persistent tension between the pursuit of justice and the reach of organized crime, a tension playing out in courtrooms around the world. The judge's safety, the integrity of the process, and the integrity of the record all become focal points as the case resumes under tighter security and renewed caution. Legal teams prepare amended protection plans, including enhanced courtroom barriers, trained marshals at all entrances, and revised protocols for witnesses who may be targets. The incident draws attention to cooperation in cartel prosecutions, with prosecutors promising coordination across jurisdictions. As the machinery of justice adapts, a question remains about how power and fear intersect in the courtroom. The 6 subsets, each with its own territory, its own set of responsibilities, yet all answer to the same shadow that loomed over the rancho's corridors, the unbroken thread that tied every hustle to a single throne. From the docks to the warehouse yards, the operation moved with a smooth inevitability born of years of watching, waiting, and weaving intelligence into action. A first contact report crackled over the radios, a chorus of clipped syllables in street talk that turned the air into a map of the night. The target's inner circle did not scatter so much as tighten, funneling into the bowels of a concrete fortress where the river of cash and guns ran deepest. Inside, the air was thick with the sting of diesel and adrenaline. A guard post collapsed under the precision of a coordinated breach, doors peeling back to reveal concrete stairwells that vanished into shadow. In a suite that had long served as a nerve center, the principal lieutenants were rounded up one by one, their hands rising in surrender, or their lips forming the stubborn line of denial that never quite met the eyes. Cells lit up with the glow of handheld devices as encrypted chatter dissolved into the language of bonds, payoffs, and routes that threaded through the harbor by night and the streets by day. We watched the anatomy of a criminal command, a ledger that smelled of ink and bribes, a calendar of shipments, a ledger of debts that spiraled across state lines. Documents spilled onto tables as agents culled through them, each page another confession written in accounting terms and street slang. Corporate shells peeled away to reveal the siphons that kept the empire alive, money laundering narratives disguised as trucking invoices, front companies trading in lacquered promises and counterfeit certificates, crews posted in towers of steel who spoke in a dialect of fear and loyalty.
Sinaloa Cartel Federation now has an element within it that has allied themselves with his cartel.
The arrest of El Mencho's top lieutenant up the chain came at the heart of the raid, the moment when the walls seemed to lean in and listen. A handcuffed figure stood under the glare of the room's fluorescent white, eyes blinking as if waking from a dream that had stretched over a lifetime. "You are under arrest," the words hissed through the microphone, not as a sentence meted out, but as a doorway slammed shut on a long hall of corridors that no longer ran straight. The chain of command, 6 subsets answering to a single throne, began to crack in real time, fissures opening where there had been only firm scaffolding. Outside, the harbor woke in slow, tense breaths. A mother's window threw a pale rectangle of light across the pavement, and in that light, a boy stopped in his tracks, watching the armored convoy roll past as if a moving wall had blocked the night from pretending it wasn't there. A dock worker spoke into a phone with a voice that was half fear, half awe, relief that the night's thunder had yielded something tangible, a piece of the structure that could be held, counted, charged. Evidence crossed borders in the form of lines on a map and the stubborn clink of metal on metal. Seized manifests, forged documents, digital trails from encrypted apps that never quite disappeared, only evaporated and reappeared in the hands of investigators who knew how to read them. The Rancho San Pedro gang, long a local machine with a global appetite, now found its gears squealing under the forced lubrication of federal seizures and coordinated interdiction. The Mexican mafia front, behind which the empire had learned to hide, revealed its own tremor as offshore accounts trembled and routing schemes frayed at the edges. Interviews with captured suspects yielded a chorus of small truths that hinted at a larger architecture. Names that meant nothing to a passerby began to carry weight in the rooms where indictments were drafted and long hours were spent tracing the echoes of every shipment back to a single origin point. The 6 subsets, each with territory and purpose, began to show what happens when a machine that survived on fear and access is faced with accountability and the steady pressure of a legal system that refuses to blink. Across the border, the ripple effects arrived in a different key. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states began recalibrating their own playlists of tactics. Surveillance grids sharpened, lengths of informants reinforced, and a renewed emphasis on cross-border extradition channels that could pull the thread of this case from the harbor to the courthouse. The international dimension of the operation, once a whisper in the back rooms of federal offices, now took center stage as prosecutors talked of charges that would require cooperation with Mexican authorities, and judges who would later decide where the scales of justice would finally settle the balance of power. In the aftermath, the questions multiplied as fast as the shadows had dissolved. What did this mean for El Mencho's control over the empire? Who would wear the crown now that the suitor to that throne had been boxed in and pulled from the shadows into daylight? The answers would not be written in one night, nor would they be settled by slogans or sensational headlines. They would unfold in courtrooms, in extradition corridors, in the quiet rooms where investigators compared timelines and dialed back to verify every link in the chain. And yet, for all the strategic success of the raid, something else stirred beneath the surface. An urgent reminder that every arrest is also a transition moment, a pivot point in a long story about power, fear, and the fragile grip of order on both sides of the border. The night had opened with a clash of metal and rotor blades and closed with a different kind of pressure. The pressure to deliver justice that could outlast the swagger of the criminal underworld, to disentangle legitimate commerce from the currents of crime that fed it, and to survive the inevitable pull of retaliation, recalibration, and the next move in a game that never truly ends. As dawn finally bled into the horizon, the harbor's hush settled again, and the city began to breathe with a more careful, deliberate pace. The operation had captured a fragment of the empire, but it also exposed the arteries that fed it, arteries that authorities would now chase with renewed determination. The arrest was not the end of the story. It was the opening of a new chapter in a saga that would demand patience, precision, and a willingness to follow every thread wherever it might lead. What comes next would test the resilience of law enforcement, the resolve of prosecutors, and the courage of communities caught in the crossfire of a war not fought with pistols alone, but with paperwork, extraditions, and the slow, steady work of building a different kind of order from the ground up. The next move, already being weighed in conference rooms and courthouses, would reveal who truly owned the throne in the wake of El Mencho's fall, and how the fight to redefine power in this fractured landscape would be waged in the days to come. The next chapter would not open with triumph, but with the steady hum of a city recalibrating itself around the absence of a familiar engine. If the first night of the raid had shown law enforcement what a machine looks like when you pull key players out of circulation, the days that followed would test the patience of prosecutors, the nerve of detectives, and the willingness of neighborhoods to trust again that the thread connecting them to fear could be cut and kept cut. In the streets, the absence was palpable but incomplete. The padlocks on shop fronts had been swirled with new courage, not simply fear, and a few small storefronts announced late hours with the stubborn pride of a community pushing back against vacancy. People spoke in low tones about relief, the kind that comes not from fireworks, but from the quiet belief that the morning might not bear the weight of yesterday's violence. Yet, relief was uneven, a patchwork quilt that left some pockets of the city unguarded by daylight.
We won't harm anyone except for those that deserve it. If you deserve it, you better hide because we will come.
The people who had learned to live with the threat did not disappear. They learned to measure it differently, to count on systems that could answer with more than memory. Within the courtroom, the federal proceedings moved with the deliberate tempo that large cases require. The 13 arrested figures faced indictments that read like blueprints of a sprawling enterprise, an organization that the government argued extended beyond the blocks of Rancho San Pedro and through the channels of the prison system that gave its upper echelon both awe and fear. The indictments framed the Mexican mafia not as a loose coalition of actors, but as an integrated machine, command and control architecture, with shot callers translating orders into street-level action, and with a discipline that tolerated no weak links. For the defense, the strategy was to sever those lines, to peel back the layers that connected the street to the penitentiary, to argue that not every act was a rational business decision, but sometimes a violent reflex, a response to an ecosystem that rewarded silence and punished deviation. The prosecutors did not simply assemble a case, they stitched together a narrative of how money traveled, how funds moved from illicit markets to the pockets of a hierarchy that spoke in the measured cadence of parent organizations, the kind that loved order even when it wore a gun. They presented ledgers and cell phone records and surveillance footage not as sensational artifacts, but as the scaffolding of a larger claim that this was an organized enterprise, not a collection of isolated criminals with a shared taste for risk. The RICO charge, which could tether each defendant to a broader, more perpetual machine, hung over the proceedings like a spotlight, with both promise and peril. The promise of accountability and the peril of overreach if the proof failed to travel across every edge of the story. Extraditions became a central thread in the weeks after the raid. The federal team, ever mindful of the way power migrates, pressed colleagues in neighboring jurisdictions to secure testimony from witnesses who had once feared the consequences of speaking out. Some of these witnesses were reluctant, tempered by the long memory of what happened to those who talked too loudly or too publicly. Others found a courage born of fatigue, the fatigue that comes from years of watching the same machinery grind people down, and from seeing too many families pulled into the same orbit of fear. The paperwork moved with them, a slow, stubborn crawl across borders and bureaucracies, until each signature meant a step closer to a courtroom where the former enforcers might finally be held to account. But the investigation did not pause for the glow of a courtroom win. In the neighborhoods, detectives and social workers began to map something new, the limits of the old code, and the glimmers of something else trying to be born in its place. A coalition formed in the margins, a city council member, a handful of pastors, educators, and small business owners who had learned to speak in a language not entirely familiar to lawmakers. They called it a different kind of order, a framework for legitimacy built on transparency, inclusion, and opportunity rather than fear and extraction. They proposed programs to redirect resources that had once flowed toward protection money into after-school centers, job training hubs, and small business incubators. They talked about storefronts that could thrive without the gloss of protection fees, about a city that could finally count on the steady rhythm of revenue generated by legitimate commerce, rather than the irregular drumbeat of illicit taxes. This emergent plan did not erase the old threats. It asked communities to own the risk of transformation. In some blocks, older residents watched the air for the sudden fall of a warning shot. In others, new faces moved through the same sidewalks with a different kind of resolve. One that did not require a knife to secure respect, but the steady investment of time, accountability, and opportunity. The plan required cooperation from every level. Local authorities, state agencies, even the federal system, which had learned to respect the value of boots-on-the-ground credibility as much as the power of indictments and warrants. It was a long bet, one that depended less on the swift armor of a raid and more on the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust. Within the prisons, the upper echelon found themselves in a precarious limbo. The captains of the machine, those who had spent years issuing commands from behind barred windows and coded lines of communication, were suddenly faced with a different kind of pressure. The realization that their reach depended upon a fragile chain of obedience that stretched across distance, not just fear. The corridors of the penitentiaries became a separate theater, where arguments were made about loyalty and survival, where threats had to contend with the reality that the federal system could sever the chain of command by removing the links. Inmates who had once been the quiet engines of discipline now faced the unsettling truth that their authority could be eroded by the courage of those willing to testify, the discipline of the prosecutors, and the new social contract forming outside the walls. Meanwhile, the families of the accused, many of them bound to this conflict by love, not choice, stood at the edge of public life, navigating the thin line between loyalty and fear. Some sought safety through relocation and secrecy. Others found their voices in the chambers of community meetings or in the pages of local journalism, where the discussion shifted from who was guilty to what kind of city they would become if the old order dissolved. The human cost, always the quiet undercurrent in stories like this, reminded everyone why the work mattered. It wasn't only the removal of specific individuals from the streets. It was the creation of an atmosphere in which young people could dream beyond the walls that had historically boxed them in.
Lots of weapons. What is this weapon here?
It's a 40-millimeter grenade launcher. This is modern warfare. We use war technologies.
And the reassurance to parents that their children could walk the streets without a warning track record of violence tagging behind them. As the day stretched into weeks, a pattern began to emerge. The raid's immediate impact, the arrest of key decision-makers, the disruption of supply lines, the exposure of the money flows was real, but it did not instantly eradicate fear or arrogance. The machine did not vanish in a single strike. It retooled. It attempted to migrate, to fracture into smaller fiefdoms, to find new choke points where law enforcement might be less prepared. The long game, the one that would determine what kind of order would eventually take root, would hinge on whether communities could sustain the momentum released by the raid, whether the judicial process could convert momentum into lasting accountability, and whether the neighborhoods could translate the rhetoric of reform into tangible improvements that could be felt in the daily lives of ordinary people. If the next move in this unfolding drama was a question, the answer would arrive in scattered signs. A witness who stood by their testimony after months of pressure. A prosecutor who found a novel legal strategy to connect the entire enterprise to the day-to-day operations on the street. A small business owner who offered lessons learned about resilience and renewal. A school administrator who mapped out after-school programs with the same precision once reserved for crime analytics. Each sign would be a thread in a larger tapestry, the one that would decide how power would rearrange itself in this fractured landscape. It would reveal not only whether the police and prosecutors could hold the line, but whether the city itself could choose a future where the ledger of crime did not outweigh the ledger of opportunity. The next briefing would carry with it a sense of measured anticipation, an acknowledgement that the most consequential battles were not those fought in the courtroom or the press, but in the quiet resolve of communities choosing to redefine what it meant to belong here. The thread would keep winding forward, connecting the blocked alleyways of yesterday to the well-lit avenues of tomorrow, linking the work of investigators with the hopes of families who deserved a chance to thrive. And somewhere along that continuum, the question would hover: when the dust settled, would the city recognize that the throne of fear could be dismantled not by power alone, but by a patient, persistent belief in something better? The story, for now, continued to move in two directions at once: upward into the corridors of justice and outward into the lives of people who refused to let a shadow define their days. The outcome remained uncertain, the stakes still high, and the city, in its stubborn, hopeful way, leaned into the slow work of turning a page toward a different kind of order, even as the old orders whispered that the page would never be clean, that ink would smear, and that the next chapter would demand more courage than the last. And it did, because it always does, when communities decide to act as if the future matters more than the fear of the past. In a courtroom designed for solemn business, the verdict of a long and watched case against a notorious cartel figure lands with the measured cadence of a practiced judge. The sentence is read in exacting language, each clause designed to close a chapter of violence and influence. Spectators hold their breath as the moment crystallizes into an official record. Then the room shifts in an instant, as if a second verdict were written in air instead of ink. Without warning, the defendant rises. The movement is swift, trained, and deliberate, a calculated attempt to challenge the authority seated at the bench. Security officers respond with practiced quickness, closing ranks and forming a barrier between the chair and the defendant. The judge, momentarily stunned but unbroken, resumes the posture of command as the courtroom erupts into a controlled scramble. Officers grapple with the aggressor, pinning arms and securing the aisle so no further harm can reach the bench. For several tense seconds, the room holds its collective breath before order begins to return. Security teams shift, cameras record, and the judge continues through the sentencing with measured calm as staff clear the immediate area. The act, though quelled, sends a tremor through the proceedings and underscores the volatility surrounding trials tied to powerful criminal networks. Observers describe a room and a case that have long been in the public eye, a stage where the state asserts control against a backdrop of intimidation. From a procedural viewpoint, security protocols are scrutinized after the incident. Court officers review entrances, exits, and the assignment of personnel who intervene when a threat arises. Prosecutors and defense teams acknowledge the need to balance justice with safety, an equilibrium that preserves the record, protects witnesses, and maintains public confidence in a process that can seem fragile when violence intrudes. Analysts place the episode within a larger pattern, the clash between law enforcement and the violent structures that confer influence on individuals who stand before the court. Indeed, the case has loomed over regions affected by cartel activity for years, making the courtroom a symbolic battleground where the state's reach is tested and sometimes challenged. Security experts note that the incident will likely influence future courtroom design, rehearsal for emergencies, and the speed with which orderly restraints are deployed to prevent escalation. Meanwhile, the legal process continues along its prescribed path. Sentencing remains a matter of record, and appeals, if any, are processed with the same rigor that governs any serious criminal case.